I am looking to get some information out to people who are interested in investing in renewable energy. Um, I am I am what you would call a lab rat. I am not a salesman. Um, I'm not an investment portfolio advisor. My primary interest is in science, what goes on in a lab. One of the uh, One of the challenges that I encountered many years ago uh, was in regards to renewable energy. My time goes back in the 70s when people were first starting to become aware of the issues with fossil fuels. Um, my first encounter with it, I was stationed on a U.S. military base. I was doing nuclear weapons security for the Air Force. As a result, I had regular conversation with Air Force pilots. I had just gone through a weekend leave where I was trying to get home to Buffalo, New York from the East Coast, um, New Hampshire, and I had 3 days off, um, and I basically had to drive back and forth between the two. And what was happening at the time was we were having gas shortages. So we had uh, the thing set up where the only way you could buy gas was if it was an even numbered day and you had an even numbered license plate. And you were only allowed to buy, I think it was 20 gallons of gas. So I hopped in my car and fueled my car up and headed out to Buffalo and got halfway home and ran out of fuel, and my plate number didn't match the number of the day, so I had trouble getting gasoline to finish my trip home on leave. And when I got back, I was telling the story to an Air Force pilot on the flight line, and he told me, he said, well, he said all of the gasoline shortages that we're suffering in the United States right now are being manufactured by the oil industry. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, he said, if you go out flying over the through the Bay Area here, where all of the ports feed off the ocean for the ocean going fuel tankers, he said you'll find hundreds of oil tankers anchored off the shore. He said, and they're running deep in the water, which the military description for a pilot means if it's running deep, it's fully loaded. He said, and they're just sitting out there and nobody's taking fuel off of them. He said, and the reason that they're doing that is so they can force the prices of gasoline higher, which it worked because the American people happily paid more for gasoline once they lifted the restrictions, the purchasing restrictions of it. So from that point on, I began to realize that the big oil companies were not our friends. They were going to do whatever they had to do to manipulate us into paying as much as they could get us to pay for fossil fuels. So that was the point where I began to understand who the oil industry was. They're not our friends. They want us paying as much money as they can get us to pay for oil, and they know how to twist our arms to do it. So, um, being of the scientific mind, I started looking at the things that were becoming more popular at that days. They were called renewables, and those were the relatively new times for renewables. So I started looking at the wind turbines and solar panels, and primarily at those times, those were the two biggest renewable things. And started looking at the problems that were manifesting with those. And way back in the 70s, the problems that were manifested were the availability times of the energy that was put out by these devices. In other words, a wind turbine wouldn't give you any energy if the wind wasn't blowing, and the solar panel wouldn't give you any energy if the sun wasn't shining. And being a scientist and looking for solutions to problems, it occurred to me that the primary problem with that whole design was they were trying to pull the energy out of that in the form of electricity, which electricity has no patience, it will not wait. You had to use it as soon as it was generated. So it was pretty obvious that what they had to do was to figure out a way to gather that energy without gathering it in the form of electricity. So, being the son of a steam fitter, um, one of the things I was very familiar with that they used for energy in the construction industry was compressed air. And the reason that they used it was they could store it and draw from it as it was needed. And when you're talking about air tools, that's exactly what that is. Works very well. In those days, they didn't used to use electricity to start truck engines. They used compressed air. Though that's typically for diesel engines. That went for trains also. So they weren't using electric batteries to turn motors to start engines. They were using pneumatic motors and compressed air to start the engines. So there were machines that were developed long ago that functioned with compressed air. So I began looking at that aspect from the point of view of generating electricity. And what I found out was what was invented a long time ago was air motors. You might be familiar with an air motor uh, on a on a pneumatic tool that they use for tightening the nuts on tires. They hook them up to an air line and they put the lug nuts on a tire with them and they take them off with them too. Call it air impact wrench. So work can be done with compressed air. Um, the other thing that you can drive with compressed air is an electrical generator. So if you put all of these things together and you think about using a wind turbine to compress air and then using compressed air to drive a generator, now all of a sudden you push a wind turbine into functioning for you for power when the wind isn't blowing because you collect the compressed air with the wind turbine and store it until you need it later on when you need electricity. Now, what this does in the renewable industry is it takes that condition that's called saturation, which is problematic for the renewable energy industry, and it eliminates it. Let me explain that a little bit better. Um, if you don't have a need for electricity, then you don't need a wind turbine. If you have a need for enough electricity that you can generate with one wind turbine, there's no reason to build two. But if you don't have any wind blowing and you have no electricity, there is no reason to build two. There was no reason to build one. However, if you build two wind turbines and collect and store that energy in the form of compressed air, now you can have the energy needed by one wind turbine for the length of time of two when the wind is only blowing half the time. So what that means is that by adding more wind turbines, you increase the amount of time that you have available to generate electricity, as well as generating the amount of electricity. Now, from a salesman standpoint in solar panels, right now you can reach a point of saturation with a solar panel because if the number of panels you have meets what your ultimate maximum required load is at the moment, selling more than it is not relevant. But if you can sell more solar panels and store that energy, then you could effectively sell 3 times as many solar panels in the same area that you would be able to sell one for the base load requirement. So what I just gave you a hint of is that now takes wind turbines and solar panels and makes them a base load element. And if you're an investor, you want to find out what base load means, but um, in electrical supplies, a nuclear power plant is considered a base load element because it gives you a certain output that's continuous all day long. By converting wind turbines and solar panels to baseload devices, now they become as viable for an electrical energy source as the reasoning for nuclear power plants. And obviously, the bad effects of wind and solar are nowhere near that of storing volatile nuclear waste. So from an investor standpoint here, what I'm telling you is that I'm introducing a new concept into a market that is definitely in need of energy storage solution for wind and solar. And that's basically what I as a lab rat has done. And I pretty much explained to you how it's done. Um, I'm going to be looking for people to build one of these units, and the people I'm looking for are first of all salesmen, because you have to have a salesman doing the sales to a community, um, and they are also going to have to do some of the sales to investors and to electricians to become involved in a project. But the other one, as I was saying, is electricians. So I'm looking for two different people to do a build on a demonstration project. And the two people are going to be a salesman and electrician. Uh, the reason that I choose salesman and electrician is because these are going to be the two groups of people who will be representing energy sales in our local communities, because these devices are built for local applications. They're not in a grid application. Um, all of the energy that's needed for these things can be acquired locally. There is no reason to reach out beyond your community for the energy for these things, because the energies are typically available locally in the forms of wind or solar or both, or in some cases hydro, and in other cases even geothermal. All of these energy sources can be used to be converted into compressed air to be drawn from as needed. Um, what I'm looking for right now are people who are interested in possibly doing investments into one of these builds. Um, it is a relatively new science, and I certainly wouldn't expect you to make any knee-jerk decision to become involved financially in this thing. So what I'm doing right now is I am inviting you to become involved in conversations between myself and the electricians I was telling you about and the salesman. And if in our conversations with that as an investor you like what you're hearing, um, that would be the point where you would reach out to these electricians and salesmen and make them an offer to get involved. Now, those agreements are between you and them. I'm simply passing on information and answering questions as anyone comes up with them. But from an investor standpoint, you would be looking at an investment that could turn out to be quite lucrative in general for people making investments, because it's an energy investment and energy can be sold. We know energy can be sold. Um, but one of the other things that you want to take into account here from an investor standpoint is the salability of a product. Now, if you get into the science of renewables, what you will discover is that it is the machinery that is built to recover the renewable energies that has the expense. The energy itself is free. So once the equipment is paid for, the income continues with that equipment uh, uh, for as long as the equipment remains viable. So basically, what that means is there's a little bit of expense in doing maintenance on that equipment. Um, and because we're not talking about high temperature equipment like furnaces and things like that, this equipment isn't going to suffer any of the damages that equipment gets from being subjected to heat. So the maintenance of this equipment cost is very, very low. I'm figuring that once the equipment is paid for, the average homeowner who buys electricity for heat, light, and automobile transportation is probably going to spend about $200 a year. Um, and while it might be a little bit higher than that, because certainly those prices are dictated by the people who are selling the energy, um, finding people to buy that energy at that rate is, it would be very easy to sell that to every single person in your community once you build one of those machines. So the prospects of return on your investments is very, very attractive. Um, the pricing of the electricity would be determined entirely by the people who are building and selling the electricity in an area, which means that you could encounter competition in doing that. But that competition is what's going to cause those electrical prices to be low. And if you are cognizant of those things as an investor, um, you would be safe in depending on a return from that energy. So those are all things that you have to deal with, and the way to deal with it is to sit down and talk with others about it and get all your ducks in a row and decide on what you want to do. So I put this Vimeo up to give you a brief description as a potential investor. And if you think it's something you might like to do, give me a shout on my email. It's dragmit5000 at gmail.com. That's DRAGMIT 5000 at gmail.com. And send me your email address, and I will put you on my contact list to let you know when we're going to be having discussions online through Facebook or something similar to that. I don't know for sure what that'll be. It might be our own website, but we'll give you an opportunity to become involved in online live discussions with these things, or to reach out and contact anybody individually to have discussions with them, and give you an opportunity to stay up to speed on what's happening. So that's my email address. Dragmit is my name spelled backwards, Dragmit. My name is Tim Gard. Um, if you have an interest, give me a shout on an email and I'll make sure I get you on that list. Thanks.